It is 4 o'clock. I will call this meeting to order. We'll begin with the roll call, please.
Mayor Sue Patterson,
Present.
Deputy Mayor Warren Dickert,
Present.
Councillor Harold Fleet,
Present.
Councillor Dave Hawking,
Present.
Councillor Carol Hudson,
Present.
Councillor Brandon Cable,
Present.
Councillor Susan Sackle.
Thank you. All members are accounted for. We'll start with our land acknowledgement. We wish to acknowledge the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe Nation, the people of the Three Fires known as Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations, and further give thanks to the Chippewas of Saugeen and the Chippewas of Nawash, now known as the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation, as the traditional keepers of this land. So good afternoon, council, staff, guests, and the viewing public and the media. I will ask council, does anyone have a disclosure of pecuniary interest? Seeing none, of course, if one should arise during the meeting, you may declare it then. This special meeting today, April 4th, 2023, we have one delegation, and we have Murray Clark from Erebus Municipal Services. He is going to speak about growing prosperity in West Grey and Hanover. Welcome, Murray.
Thank you, Your Worship. How's that for audio?
Very good.
Thank you. All right. Always a blessing when the technology is functioning, which is usually the exception in my case. Well, thank you, Your Worship, Mayor Patterson, and members of council and staff and others. Thank you for receiving me today. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I just wanted to observe, this is my first time in your facility here, and I was sharing with your CAO that it's a marvelous facility. And if I was still actively working as a CAO, I think I'd have facility envy here. So you're very fortunate. It's a lovely facility. And I will introduce myself in a moment, just to move on with the we're verifying communications here, apparently. Initializing connection. Green line, approaching the end. There we go. Introduction. I want to qualify that this presentation is really a collaborative effort. To a certain extent, I'm the delivery agent here. I did have some role in preparing the material, but it was very much a collaborative effort, as you know, I think, among the team at Grey County and your CAO and your staff as well, and their counterparts at West Grey. And so this is truly a collaborative effort that we're going to share with you today. The municipalities of West Grey and Hanover have tremendous growth potential. As neighbors, we can work together and find mutually beneficial solutions that will see both communities and the region prosper. My firm was engaged by the county to help facilitate these discussions and advance the conversation ideally. And through conversation and discussion, as in all of our endeavors in life, really, we can better understand each other, identify opportunities, and openly discuss best interests of the communities. In terms of agenda, I'll outline the primary goals of our visit here today. My visit here today, a very preliminary step in what hopefully will be a process. I'll introduce myself. I'll introduce the planning context, which is very well known to this room, I know. And further to that, to talk a little bit about the context for growth and the challenge that Hanover particularly is facing over the 25-year planning horizon take a brief look at the context again with official plan amendment number 11. Again, you're familiar with that. And share some preliminary research that we've done collaboratively on relatively recent decisions on expansion solutions in Ontario. A number of important considerations which I would offer are to a certain extent a homework assignment, and we'll talk about that when we get there, and talk about next steps ideally that we would be following when we move to the next step. Much of the content here will be familiar to you. The approach, and I think my role here is somewhat representative of what we are presenting as perhaps a fresh new conversation, a new approach with some potential opportunity here. And we'll talk about that. Who am I and what brings me here, and what gives me the sort of authority to represent this matter? I know that Sherry's heard me describe myself this way before, but typically I describe myself as a recovering CAO. I retired almost 6 years ago, a little early, after 37 years in local government, 34 years as a chief administrative officer in municipalities in Ontario and British Columbia, and then back to Ontario, where I retired as CAO from Kincardine, not too far away. And one of my goals in retirement was to stay engaged in the business. I loved the local government sector. It was being a CAO in a smaller community. I ideally suited my temperament and I think my approach. And I loved my career. I loved the business. I wanted to stay engaged. So I set up the company, full disclosure, with a fuzzy business plan at best and low expectations. But I've been busy ever since, and I've had to turn work away. I've had to sort of reach some kind of a balance because I am supposed to be retired. But I've had some really interesting engagements and assignments over the last 5.5 years. And one of them was almost a full year as acting CAO at Bruce County through essentially all of 2019. I came to know the team at the county, particularly at Grey County, with some interaction that we had between Bruce County and Grey County, particularly with some challenges that Bruce County was experiencing with long-term care, which was a whole new area for me. And when, fast forward to last fall, really around the time of the election, just after the election, I guess, the county CAO, Grey County CAO, Kim Wingrove, whom you know, reached out to me and asked me if I would think about participating in this conversation that we're having right now. And because my post-retirement career, or my retirement post-career, has been all about new experiences and remaining engaged in the business, this was an area new to me, really, to a certain extent, and fascinating to me. And I said, yes. So that's what brings me here today. I also worked, actually, I just finished a 2-year contract with the Ontario Municipal Administrators Association as strategic planning coordinator. And through my work there, as it happened, I was engaged with a number of similar initiatives, at least in the advisory and research level. So it's not completely strange to me. So that's enough about me. The primary goals that we're looking at here, to a certain extent, this is somewhat symbolic, intended to send positive messages out to all stakeholders in this process. And so we want to understand the current growth scenarios for both municipalities. And I think this room has a good grounding in that regard, understanding the opportunities that are presented and the positive impact that strategic growth can bring to both municipalities and the region, including the county. Open the door, which is our real goal here, opening the door for a fresh dialogue between the two municipalities. And most importantly, perhaps most importantly from the West Grey perspective, is to approach this conversation on the basis or with the concept of mutual prosperity underlying the entire conversation. There will be an opportunity for questions after the slide deck, but if you have any comments or questions, obviously through the chair, I'd be happy to attempt to respond. I do, again, in the interest of full disclosure, I'm not a land use planner, although I do teach a land use planning workshop. But I would also suggest that on some of the technical questions, particularly land use planning, your staff is very likely better equipped than I am to respond with detailed intelligence. Initiating discussions. These conversations started really last fall, as you know, at the staff level with full consent of the councils of the 3 municipalities, county included. I was engaged to facilitate discussions and look into areas of common interest and collaboration. And just a sidebar note, when I say we and my firm, this is the firm. I am Arabesque Municipal Services Incorporated. And so you're talking to the president of the company here. This, I think you'll have a sense from the comments already that this entire conversation really should be underpinned with openness and transparency and inclusivity. And the discussions to date at the staff level have been based on those concepts. And to date, no decisions have been taken, obviously, but the purpose has to reinforce our role as staff, former role as staff, and the role of your staff, and that is to provide information to you so that you can take informed decisions and decide on steps forward. In terms of mutual goals, whatever the outcome, the goal of this project is finding a win-win-win scenario where West Grey, Hanover, Grey County all benefit. And I've described this, I've used this sort of analogy that in collective bargaining, and I've been involved in quite a few contract negotiations over the years. There's an old sort of saying in collective bargaining that if all parties leave the bargaining table equally unhappy, then you'll know you've succeeded. We're taking an opposite approach to this, that at the end of the day, if we achieve success, that success can only look like all parties walking away from this process equally happy. And that's how success has to be defined here. We'll talk about very briefly Grey County OPA 11. And this may be somewhat broader than potential future secondary plan areas as identified in that OPA. We've researched other communities. As I mentioned, quite a bit of research is available, and you can find this online as well on how recent and maybe not so recent decisions have been taken on boundary adjustments. And all of that information has been shared with your staff and the staff at West Grey. A bit of an introduction to the land use planning context. You know that the provincial policy statement provides overall policy direction on all land use matters in Ontario. The provincial policy statement, or PPS, was last updated in 2020 after a long wait. It's expected that there may be further changes coming down to the provincial policy statement, particularly to catch up to really the rather aggressive provincial legislative agenda in terms of growth and settlement, and particularly the Greenbelt. But that remains to be seen. We know, and one of the reasons we're here to talk to you today is that municipalities are required to plan on a horizon out of 25 years for both employment and residential lands. Upper tier municipalities are required to identify and allocate population, housing, and employment growth. The projections that we're working with today are included in the Grey County official plan. And final note on that slide, that a revised growth management study was completed by the county of Grey in 2020. 2021. Municipalities can use and refine growth numbers to plan for growth and infrastructure needs across all areas of planning. An important point here, municipalities are required to use land efficiently and intensify growth before expanding settlement areas. And I know you're working diligently here in Hanover to work to that agenda to pursue infill and intensification opportunities wherever you can. And finally, the provincial policy statement prioritizes growth in settlement areas logically with full municipal pipe services, water and wastewater services. In terms of growth context, the Grey County growth context is at least the state of the union here, 9-member municipalities with the area and populations as at 2021 are shown here. All Grey County municipalities are growing and planning for infrastructure needs. Planning for growth takes time. Municipalities must be proactive and productive and plan years in advance. And I can don't mind sharing with you, I'm doing some work with the municipality of Mapleton in Wellington County, caught up in the Greater Golden Horseshoe growth scenario. And compared to this community and West Grey and the Grey County municipalities, they're really under the gun in terms of pressure for growth. Here you've got the luxury of some time, I think, to manage growth in a more, I think, perhaps relaxed fashion. But there are other communities in Southern Ontario particularly that are really experiencing tremendous growth for pressure for growth. I think of my hometown of Fergus and Center Wellington now, and what Elora looks like compared to what it looked like when I was a kid, and Fergus too. And my mother taught at the high school, by the way. And so we're very much in a period of flux and change here. Economic considerations, and these are significant, at least the economic opportunity, I think, that ultimately could be presented through this conversation. Municipalities need a supply of service land to meet projected needs. Designated, zoned, and service lands for employment, residential or commercial development spurs investment in the community. It's important to be flexible and have a variety of parcel sizes, locations, and prices available. Makes a community attractive. The market likes a choice. Limited and open as well. West Grey's growth needs. West Grey is projected to grow as follows, pursuant to the county's growth management study. An additional something just less than 2,000 people, about 840 households, just under 700 jobs. And again, logically, most of the growth is expected in the settlement areas of Durham and Newstat, shown in red on the plan. Some growth also in the secondary settlement areas shown in orange. Hard to see, but those are secondary growth areas. For example, Crawford, Elmwood, Ayton. Durham and Newstat both have municipal water and sewer services. The context of West Grey's growth, West Grey has recently experienced challenges or demand for growth with two fairly large subdivisions in Durham. Other subdivisions and multi-residential developments are in the planning stages in Durham. Ongoing redevelopment of the Rockwood Terrace and long-term care home. Recent proposed expansion of Chapman's into West Grey. Two older draft-approved subdivisions in Newstat. And continued interest in the industrial park outside of Mount Forest. Currently, West Grey is in the middle of an official plan review. I know they've had, I think, at least one public meeting to ensure their community's long-term planning needs are met. And the OP, the official plan, applies only to Durham and Newstat, their settlement areas, primary settlement areas. And there is currently no shortage of settlement area land in West Grey. Hanover's growth context, by comparison, Hanover is expected to grow as follows, again, pursuant to this study with the 2046 horizon of about 3,400 people, 1,700 households, and 1,500 jobs. That's a significant demand. In the past 13 years, Hanover has completed and refined a number of growth studies, and these have indicated that Hanover does not have sufficient land to meet your needs over the next 20 plus years. And you're not alone in Ontario, that's for sure. Further notes on the growth context here in Hanover, the studies have examined planning policies, servicing needs, obviously critical, impact on natural environment, impact on agriculture, another critical consideration, and has examined suitable locations for future growth opportunities. Notes on Hanover's growth history. Again, this will be all familiar to you, I know. To facilitate long-term growth of lands adjacent to Hanover, West Grey and Hanover have previously worked together with the county to investigate growth opportunities. I think that's a spelling error in opportunities there. On lands in West Grey adjacent to Hanover. And for example, OPA 80 in 2012 was approved. It created a future secondary plan area in West Grey abutting the east end of Hanover. In 2015, 3 years later, OPA 122 designated portions of that future secondary plan area as highway, commercial, and open space. Logical uses for those lands, it seems to me. And OPA 122 was a joint application between the two municipalities. OPA 80 and 122 did not change, as we know, did not change the municipal boundary. This next plan, again, a little difficult to read, but it illustrates the areas encompassed by both OPA 80 in 2012 and then OPA 122 in 2015. And you can see the hatched lines south of 10th Street and projecting into the east. Again, this will all be very familiar to you. Hanover's growth context continued. OPA 3 approved 2 years ago, further defined how Hanover will develop within its boundaries by designating former special policy areas to residential and employment designations. OPA ensures all lands within Hanover are planned for before considering expansion to the settlement area. And that's what we talked about in terms of infill growing up rather than out. And development and intensification targets have been met or exceeded for new developments. And that's kudos to your team and your decision-making here, Your Worship. Looking to the future growth scenarios, To reinforce the point, growing out is only to be explored when options for growing up have been exhausted. But remember, we're talking about a 25-year horizon here. And think about what's happened in the last 25 years to help put that into some context. And for example, Hanover OPA 3 lands designated all lands within Hanover. Majority of developments over the past few years have been achieving a minimum density of 25 units per hectare as required by the county OP. And that's impressive. Approved multi-story developments, including 2 6-story apartment buildings and a 7-story commercial/apartment building, have been approved. Again, impressive. And the county OPA number 11 included 2 new potential future secondary areas in West Gray abutting Hanover. Similar lands to the previous OPAs 80 and 122. And that OPA has been appealed by West Gray and the Magwood family farms, as we know, and is not in force and effect. Hanover's growth studies also identified 2 potential future growth areas in Brockton. And we'll illustrate some of those land use considerations here. Areas 1 and 2 are proposed future secondary plan areas on West Gray lands, which are areas of focus for us. Hanover has also explored areas 3 and 4 in Brockton and Bruce County. And to skip down to that bottom bullet, crossing a county boundary is typically more difficult than working on a solution within the same county. And that just stands to reason. Not that Bruce County would be difficult to deal with, but there are jurisdictional challenges, servicing challenges, and some natural environmental challenges on that west side as well. The province requires that when designating any new settlement area lands adjacent to an existing settlement area, that all options be considered. And so the Brockton option is a consideration, but I would offer it's a limited opportunity relative to lands to the east. Drilling down a little further into OPA 11, it proposed 2 new secondary plan areas illustrated here on this plan, areas 1 and 2, and area 3. And area 2 is a new designation. Again, this official plan amendment's under appeal. Drilling down a little further, the future secondary plan background, the FSPAs, we love acronyms in this business. The future secondary plan areas have been proposed since November of 2021. Those lands and those areas that are identified are supported by planning, environmental, and engineering studies completed by Hanover. Again, I'm talking to the choir here, singing to the choir, I guess, but you don't want to hear me sing, you really don't. FSPAs are not a boundary adjustment. They simply identified lands that are needed for future growth purposes. And quite logically, looking to a longer term growth scenario, it's not unusual at all. In fact, it's a typical model that looking to longer term growth projections to fulfill the provincial mandate of 25 years. In other jurisdictions, those studies tend to ignore municipal boundaries and look at where logical expansions should occur. It only makes sense. It's not a boundary adjustment. These future secondary plan areas reinforce that in my visit last week with Grey County. It identifies lands that may be needed for future growth purposes. An important note here, the policies of agricultural and rural designation still apply to these lands. Future OPAs, zoning amendments, the full gamut of, or gauntlet, I suppose, of land use planning approvals and servicing approvals would be required before any development could occur on those OP11 future secondary plan areas. A little further background. There will, of course, be additional public process required as part of these future official plan and zoning bylaw amendments. And one of the objectives on my visit today is to encourage discussions between and among Hanover, West Grey, and Grey County before there is any development contemplated within those areas, those future secondary plan areas. Note here, Grey County has received comments in support of and in opposition to OPA 11 from landowners and municipalities. And the parties continue to discuss those FSPAs and the next steps. Moving to high-level oversight of municipal boundary research that the staff have done, and some that I was able to identify, and looking at other municipal examples of boundary adjustments. There are several examples where there was clear benefit to both municipalities, and that goes to the win-win or the mutually beneficial solutions that must underlie this conversation. But some examples of compensation and annexation agreements include, and they range from lump sum or payment installments, shared assessment in perpetuity or for a defined period of time, collection of fees on a per building permit or per unit basis, coverage of costs to affect the change. It might include legal fees, payments for the transfer of infrastructure. There's an investment there. Clearly that investment would have to be recovered. One-time payments made to property owners is another feature of some boundary adjustments. Some are phased in over time to meet growth demands. Most are framed with language similar to that next phrase, joint prosperity agreements, again going to the win-win scenario. And in some cases, there are shared service arrangements for particularly for pipe services within those areas. To identify some important considerations, and I just want to reinforce here, we're approaching the finish line, Your Worship, that these considerations, I think, would be best regarded as maybe a homework assignment if the conversation advances and the ask, which we're going to get to in a minute, comes to fruition, that these are considerations to reflect on before we advance, if we advance to the next stage, and to reflect on as we progress through the conversation, if it continues. And that's all based on this concept of mutual prosperity. Also identifies that it would be inappropriate, I think, to reject any options at this point. All options should be on the table, should be considered and discussed. And examples under that checklist would include shared servicing, could include boundary adjustments or annexation. We talked about whether we should include the dreaded A word, amalgamation, in the study, but I think we would be selling the process short if we at least didn't identify it as an option and analyze it and deal with it as it should be dealt with. And most importantly, certainly from my perspective, and I think everybody in the room would agree, that discussions need to be built on the basis of openness and transparency. And I want to reinforce, I understand, and I have some, I think now, good understanding and knowledge of the conversations and the process that was advanced before. There was, I think, mutual accord on this matter. It didn't proceed. I think it's important to learn the lessons of history, but to reflect on that was then, this is now, and we're moving ahead with a new spirit, I think, hopefully a new spirit of cooperation and again, based on that mutually satisfactory outcome. And so how do we arrive at a win-win scenario? We need to think about the questions, and this is your homework assignment to a degree, not looking for answers today, obviously. But they're important considerations if we're to continue on this path. And what does success look like for each municipality? What does each municipality look to achieve here? What's desired? The extent of the development land, assessment growth, servicing, partnerships. what are the impacts of not achieving a locally initiated solution? And somewhat reluctant to raise the specter of the heavy hand of the province, but we've seen some really quite remarkable ministerial zoning orders, minister zoning orders come down, and cabinet decisions. Hamilton would be a good example where the province elected to impose a solution to Hamilton's growth that no one anticipated and was not in any way desirable by the parties. What are the concerns and fears of each municipality that will need to be addressed going forward? A very important point here, how will your residents, your stakeholders, your businesses be engaged in the process moving forward? Again, the notion of inclusivity and engagement and openness. Might there be areas for collaboration or joint marketing, for example, a joint regional business park? In one of our earlier meetings at the staff level, the counterparts engaged in economic development in West Grey and Hanover were already leaping ahead, thinking about what possibilities they might achieve with some cooperative economic development efforts. And how can we work collectively to be stronger? Because that's what it should be all about. Moving to next steps, and we're definitely approaching the finish line here. Reviewing input and feedback from both councils and staff, and you'll need time to reflect, and West Grey, I know, is reflecting as well. I'm happy to confirm that at the meeting last week, West Grey did move ahead, and this might not be a new headline for you, but they did agree to move ahead with the process, facilitated discussions, and they appointed Mayor Eccles and Councillor Hutchinson as their representatives to this process. So they were really quite positive. The whole reception, I would say, I would offer, and I've seen hundreds and hundreds of presentations before council, and I've made a few myself, and I felt very welcome. It was a very warm and cordial reception, and I left feeling really quite pleased with how the presentation had been received. And if each council agrees then to continue to work collaboratively to address, again, opportunities for each community. And finally, this is the ask, that each council select 2 council representatives to participate in future facilitated discussions. And one half of that ask has been achieved now. And your worship, that is the conclusion of the presentation. I want to thank you very much. I'd be happy to answer any questions. But I know I'll feel helpless with perhaps some detailed land use questions, but I'm happy to try. Thank you again.
Well, thank you, Murray. Thanks for the presentation. It's very helpful to see a summary of where we're at and how we can move forward for the benefit of all 3, Grey County, West Grey, and ourselves. So it's a good place to be. Council, questions, comments? Who's going to start? Councillor Fleet, thank you.
Thank you, Your Worship, and thank you, Murray, for your presentation. I'm going back to a time frame, and the concern I have is I'd hate to turn away an opportunity for potential business or growth in the town of Hanover, and I feel that we have to move this along fairly quickly. I know you had mentioned, we have time, but how much time?
I don't know, Councillor, that I'd be comfortable putting a sort of a specific timeline to this, but I understand that there are opportunities being presented, and the risk is losing opportunity. I've been deliberately fairly cautious and tentative in proposing advancing the process because of the sensitivity around the issue. I'm really pleased to hear your comments. It's not very clear to me in terms of my engagement, whether I will continue after this particular session. But I do understand the need for dispatch, to move with dispatch. And I wouldn't hesitate in offering that with that kind of messaging, I think we can put some real horsepower under this and get things moving. And if I could offer a subjective observation here, I truly believe this, and I do have some exposure to what's happening provincially and across the province and across the country, really. I have great connections in the West. That if we are successful here, if we can bring this off, so to speak, this will be a real example in the province of Ontario and in the country of 2-3 municipalities working together in lockstep together to achieve a solution. And if my role is continued, I'm quite prepared to light a fire under this.
Thank you. I would hate to see an opportunity lose like some type of development for West Gray or ourselves. You know, we're neighbors or friends. We've gone to school together, and it would affect both West Gray and Hanover if we lost the opportunity of attracting some type of business to this area. Thank you.
Councillor Hocking.
Thank you, Worship. Thank you, Murray. Excellent presentation. I like the context of the win-win-win. I mentioned to you before the meeting that I was involved with Mayor Patterson in attempting to get some discussion going. And we made reference to a document, I'm sure you've seen it, from Meridian Planning. It was to our former CAO of May 3rd, 2021. And when we were talking with our colleagues in West Gray, we kept running into what I would call, use the word obstacle, because it seemed that we had got sort of all our ducks in the order, but when we talked to them, they said that they had to do the same thing so that they had a planning process. Is that what they're referring to now as their official plan, or are they still in that same mode where before we begin discussions with Hanover and the county, we need to do our own planning process that we did, 2 years ago? And that seemed to be a big stall because, well, they said, we can't really negotiate with you unless we get our ducks in the order too. So I just open that to you for comment, and whether they mentioned that to you at their meeting.
It wasn't raised, Councillor. If I could offer these comments in response, as was pointed out in the presentation, the work that West Gray is doing with their official plan applies only to the 2 main settlement areas, Drayton and Neustadt. I would suggest, as the conversation advances, that West Gray be encouraged to regard the research that has been done by both Hanover and the county as good, solid, logical planning evidence. And so often through my now 43 years in this business, I've seen extensive and very costly reports and studies undertaken, and then an equally costly and somewhat duplicated process to analyze those reports. I think the evidence is clear, and that would be a point, and I probably shouldn't be coaching, but that would be a point to reinforce, I think, with West Gray, that this is objective, not subjective. This is objective technical evidence pointing to the need for growth, which is inarguable, and I would offer the location for growth. And I think I know a little bit about planning, and I've studied the documents here. I think the evidence is very clear. It's impartial and it's technical, and I think it's defensible.
Other comments, questions? Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Your Worship, and thank you, Mary, for the presentation. I look back over the time that I've been involved in this and, we've put significant resources into getting to where we are, both financial and human resources. I think, we have some fresh faces around both council tables. I think that's a positive and a good opportunity to move forward. And, I think similar to what Councillor Fleet had said, I think the timing is right. And I think we do need to pursue this sooner rather than later. And I do hope that, we can find this common ground to work forward, because it truly does have to be a win for everybody. And I was glad to see all of the options that you have listed there, that we need to, whether it's a process of elimination, take the ones off that simply can't work. But we need to, pare that down. We need to move forward, and, we have good information. We need to use it. And I think the sooner the better. So I think we all wish we had the magic answer here and what the perfect next steps are. But I do think that time is kind of the essence. I don't see it as we have as much time as maybe what the presentation said, but because they do take a long time. Even once you have a solution, they take a long time to work through. And I think even the provincial attitude right now is much more accepting of looking at alternatives and maybe things that haven't been thought of before and bringing them into play. So I do think that the timing's right and we need to move forward quickly.
Well said, Deputy Mayor. Thank you.
Other comments? Okay, I would like to say, Murray, I think it would be beneficial if you continued as the facilitator between West Grey, Hanover, and with the county. You have the experience and now you have the knowledge of what's happening here. And I think that would help move this along rather than leaving it between West Grey and Hanover to work it out on their own. I think we do need a facilitator to bring it all together. So just my bias there. So I do have a motion. The ask is to appoint members to a committee. And the motion reads that Mayor Sue Patterson and Councillor Dave Hawking continue to represent the town of Hanover in future facilitated discussions with the municipality of West Grey on collaboratively assessing growth-related opportunities for both communities. Any discussion? And if none, I need a mover and seconder. Anyone to move? Councillor Sackle and Councillor Fleet. Any further discussion? All in favor? Oh, Deputy Mayor.
I'm just going to add, I think those are good selections. You have some, you've already started some of this groundwork. You're well versed in it. So I just think it's a good option and I support it.
Thank you. I'll call the question. All in favor? That is carried unanimously. Thank you. Thank you very much, Murray. Appreciate it. Sorry. We go again. See? Very much appreciated for your presentation and the work you've done putting this together with the 3 municipalities. So
Thank you so much, Your Worship, and thank you, members of council.
Yes. Councillor Hawking.
I'm sort of in the same camp as Warren and Harold and just pawing at the earth here, Murray. You said we have some homework to do. Those questions. What's our timeline on those questions? Have you got any planned?
I'm making eye contact with your CAO here. We a couple of comments that I'm happy to share. As it happens, I'm finishing up a big project, as I mentioned, with Mapleton. I'm finishing that up. I think next week it should wrap up. And thinking of domestic harmony, I would be, and again, I really need to speak to Kim Wingrove and the team at the county. I would be quite keen actually to devote myself to this initiative and assure my wife that I really will be spending some time at home. I'm very much engaged with this. It's just the kind of attachment I have to this is a very special initiative. And I can't guarantee exclusivity. But it'll certainly have the focus of my attention if the county wants me to continue. And so, you know, we could get a meeting put together with the team, including the political representatives, as soon as possible.
I was just going to further add through you, Mayor Sue, is that there is already a scheduled debrief for next week. So some of those next steps and timing, I would assume, would be part of that conversation.
Sorry to prolong this, Murray. The homework assignment, would you would you be part of that discussion as the teacher to oversee our discussion so that you've got sort of an idea of how those were discussed and sort of all the dynamics that came into that? Or do we do that on our own? I like just my opinion. I like the fact of you being there to sort of see the dynamics of the discussion. I think it would give you an inside track as a mediator.
Again, Councillor, thank you for that. I appreciate that. I'm available if my engagement is confirmed. I'm happy to support that. I know that your CAO and your staff team are well equipped as well to support some of that homework and research and reflection, I think. It's maybe a better word. But I'm happy to support that. I have taught at night school for many, many years, so the term teacher maybe does come somewhat naturally, Your Worship.
Okay, very good. So we have one motion left, and that is to adjourn at 4:51. I need a mover and seconder. Councillor Hocking, Councillor Hudson, all in favor? That's carried. Thank you very much.